7th, exactly 1 year since Hamas attacked Israel, killed hundreds of people and took many hostage. We were in Israel a day after the attack to tell you about the shock, the grief, the anger and the building response. It was a terrorist attack, there are no two ways about it, but it set in motion a series of events that have brought West Asia on the edge of the precipice. After the death of over 40,000 people in Gaza, Israel has not been able to eliminate Hamas. It is now fighting on 7 fronts and preparing to strike Iran. As we bring you the updates tonight, we'll also look at the big picture and tell you why amid all of this, Netanyahu has picked a fight with the French president. Meanwhile, the India-out president of the Maldives is now in India. It's a reality check for Mohammad Muizzu and a win for Indian diplomacy. In Pakistan, a terror attack has killed 2 Chinese citizens. How Tunisia's election shows the failure of the Arab Spring. While leading global economists say India's growth story will remain intact despite external challenges. How companies and countries are rolling back their green targets. And why Antarctica is turning green. All this and more coming up. The headlines first. Ukraine says its forces struck a large oil terminal in Crimea. Russia claims to have downed 12 enemy-attacked drones over the peninsula overnight. In recent months, Kiev has ramped up strikes targeting Moscow's energy sector. Ukraine wants to dent Russia's revenue sources, which fund the war. Florida braces for yet another hurricane as militant threatens Mexico and the U.S. state. In fact, the hurricane has strengthened to a Category 4 storm. It is expected to hit Florida's west coast on Wednesday. Florida is still reeling from last month's Hurricane Helen. Former Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte to run for city mayor. He will be contesting in the Davao midterm polls due next year. The southern city is the Duterte family's stronghold. The 79-year-old's running mate will be his son and the incumbent mayor. Duterte was the president of the Philippines from 2016 to 2022. Ethiopian lawmakers choose their foreign minister as the country's new president. He becomes the 5th president since Ethiopia adopted its current constitution in 1995. This leaves Africa with just 1 female head of state. Now only Tanzania has a woman as its president. And 2 American scientists win the Nobel Prize in Medicine. They were honored for their discovery of the microRNA and its role in how genes are regulated. The laureates will receive their prizes in Stockholm on the 10th of December. One year of the October 7th attack, exactly 365 days ago, Hamas invaded Israel. The attack had shocked the world. It ended almost 2 decades of peace in Israel, or the closest they've been to peace in a long time. Israel retaliated against the Hamas by invading Gaza. 1 year later, the conflict has snowballed and it threatens to consume the entire region, all of West Asia. Now it appears that Israel will remain at war for the foreseeable future. It is fighting adversaries on multiple fronts and planning a direct strike on Iran, its biggest rival and sworn enemy. Israel is facing assaults from both the north and the south. In the north, it's Hezbollah. In the south, it's Hamas. Both launched attacks today. Air sirens rang out in several parts of Israel, including in Tel Aviv. Look at these pictures. This is a hotel building in Israel's Holon. A rocket attack by Hamas shattered its windows. Hamas fired at least 5 projectiles and left 2 people injured. This comes after Israel conducted airstrikes in Gaza yesterday. They struck 2 locations in central Gaza, a mosque and a school, which was being used as a shelter. Israel says these were Hamas command and control centers, and that is why they were attacked. The Israeli Defense Force, or the IDF, has no plans to go easy on Gaza. Today it issued fresh evacuation warnings, asking people living near Khan Yunis to leave. Khan Yunis is a city in southern Gaza. Similar orders were issued in the north as well. Fighting is intensifying in Lebanon too. Israel has struck more targets, more Hezbollah targets, and the other side is firing back. Yesterday, they shot more than 100 rockets across the border into Israel. And today, the Hezbollah conducted a fresh round of strikes. They damaged at least 60 apartments. They also targeted Haifa. Haifa is an important port city. Israeli forces have a base there in Haifa, and that's where the Hezbollah fired at, the military base. Now, reports say that they were successful. The rockets, the Hezbollah rockets, breached Israel's air defenses. According to reports, at least 10 people were injured. We don't have reports of any damage to the military base yet. Irrespective, the Israeli Prime Minister remains undeterred. He has vowed to keep fighting.
A year ago, we suffered a terrible blow. For the past 12 months, we've been changing reality from end to end. The whole world is astounded at the blows you inflict on our enemies, and I salute you and tell you, you are the generation of victory. Together we will fight, and together we will win.
We are changing reality. That's what Netanyahu said yesterday. He was visiting his troops in the north, where he's also deploying more troops in the north. Today, a new division of soldiers was sent to the north, taking the total number to 3 divisions, meaning 3 divisions of Israeli soldiers are stationed on the border with Lebanon. One division has anywhere between 7,500 to 10,000 soldiers. So going by this latest figure, Israel could have at least 20,000 troops fighting in the north. And that's not all. These ground troops are getting aerial support with the IDF's relentless barrage of airstrikes. So fighting is intensifying both in the north and the south. And then there is Iran, which is bracing for an attack from Israel. Over the weekend, Israel's defense minister spoke about this. His name is Yoav Gallant. And he had a message for Tehran. If you harm Israel, you'll end up looking like Gaza or Beirut. That's what he said.
The Iranians did not even scratch the capabilities of the Air Force. No squadron has been damaged. No plane has been damaged. There is no runway that doesn't allow takeoff. And there is no damage to our continuity. Whoever thinks that by trying to harm Israel, they will deter us from reacting, they only need to look at what is happening in Gaza and Beirut.
So what is Israel's plan? How will it respond to Tuesday's attack? Israel's military is taking its time. It says it will strike Iran at a time and place of its choosing. Tehran says it is ready, that if Israel attacks, they will strike back. Tehran says it has a list of, and I'm quoting, many Israeli targets. So a lot of saber rattling and a wider war looks imminent. Meanwhile, the US and other Western nations are going through the motions, calling for de-escalation, a ceasefire in Gaza, and the return of hostages. That's what they're asking for. At best, these statements sound futile because neither Iran nor Israel appear to be in the mood for diplomacy at the moment. At worst, they're hypocritical, asking for the fire to be doused while adding fuel to it.
We'll turn them into rubbles.
It was Israel's darkest day, a day that changed West Asia forever. No one saw it coming. Even when the reports trickled in, we couldn't believe it. Children had been killed, teenagers had been raped, even senior citizens tortured. We knew that Hamas was brutal, but this attack was beyond anything imaginable. It was pure evil. At first, Israel was gripped by sorrow and shock, but soon that turned into fury. A quest for revenge. And you can't blame them. After what happened on that day, Israel had to respond, and they had every right to do so. But Israel's actions went beyond self-defense. They carpet-bombed Gaza in the months ahead, even targeted schools and hospitals, and that is where Israel lost its way. They had every right to hit back, but it turned into collective punishment for all Palestinians, which is why we find ourselves here today on the brink of a regional war. So the question is, 1 year since the October 7th attack by Hamas, what has changed? What has Israel achieved in 1 year of fighting? First, let's look at how the world marked this day. We saw statements from Israel's allies, the US and the UK. Their leaders, Joe Biden and Keir Starmer, reaffirmed Israel's right to self-defense, but they also called for a ceasefire, both in Gaza and Lebanon. Across the world, we saw different kinds of events, some vigils, some rallies, and also some protests. Take a look at this first.
Everyone for coming here. We already have
One of the most horrible episodes unfolded in Reem, a settlement just outside the Gaza border. A music festival was happening there. More than 360 of the attendees were killed by Hamas. Dozens of others were taken hostage. Today, families of the victims gathered at the same place. Israel's president was also there.
This is where she was killed. So, especially here. We were last week, we were in the grave, but this is the ceremony. This is where she was. This is where she was happy in the last her moments. It was here.
We lost our son here. He was at the party. He was murdered in 9 o'clock and 20 minutes. And we are here. We don't know. It seems to be like yesterday was the last day we saw him. For us, yesterday was the last day of the old life before we start 1 year in the new life. And we are here.
Nobody can make these families whole again, and we should remember that. What Hamas did last year was not resistance, it was terrorism. And they're still holding Israelis hostage. Hamas took around 250 people hostage on that day. Reports say 97 of those people are still in their custody. Most others have been killed, some others have been returned. Today, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited a memorial for October 7th. He promised to bring the hostages back.
On this day, in this place and in many places in our country, we remember our dead, our hostages whom we are obligated to bring back, and our heroes who fell in defense of the homeland and the country.
The thing is, he's been saying that since last year, that he'll bring these people back, but he has rejected deals for exchanging hostages. Why is that? Because those deals require a ceasefire. Families of the hostages are putting pressure on Netanyahu. Even today, they protested outside his home. But the Prime Minister is not budging. He is in fact expanding the war. He's moved on from Gaza. Now he's focusing on Lebanon and Iran. Of course, the people of Gaza do not have that luxury. They're stuck in a spiral of war. October 7th marked the beginning of their death, displacement, and tragedy.
Before October 7th, one had dreams. Me as a father, I have 6 children. My biggest burden was that I provide them with homes, I find them wives. But after October 7th, this came to nothing.
Gaza has become an uninhabitable place, an unfit place to live safely at the very least, due to the destruction of everything on this land after everything in it was targeted, including stones, trees, children, men, women, and even agricultural lands and water wells, since October 7th of last year until October 7th of this year.
I hope Hamas is listening to all these people, the people they claim to represent. Around 42,000 people in Gaza are dead. Nearly every Gazan is displaced. Is this what Hamas wanted for its people? Death and displacement? If yes, well done. You have successfully hurt your own people. But let's keep the emotions aside for a moment. Let's look at the strategic landscape. What has Israel achieved since last year? Broadly, 3 things. Number 1, they have managed to weaken Hamas. Weaken, not eliminate. Hamas had nearly 25 to 30,000 fighters before October 7th last year. Israel claims to have killed 17,000 of them. Even top commanders have been taken out, including their chief Ismail Haniyeh. Israel killed him. But Hamas is not down. Is only down, it is not out. Today they fired rockets at the city of Tel Aviv. No casualties were reported, but some residential buildings were damaged. What does that tell you? That Hamas retains the ability to strike Israel. It's a direct challenge to Netanyahu because he said that his war goal was to eliminate Hamas. Yet Hamas is firing rockets at Tel Aviv. Number 2, Israel finds itself isolated on the global stage. What happened at the United Nations sums it up. Netanyahu walked up to address the General Assembly. Immediately, dozens of delegates walked out, which shouldn't have been the case. Remember, Israel was the victim last year. The whole world was mourning with them. But Netanyahu's tactics put them off. He basically squandered the moral high ground. Which brings us to the third point. The future looks very unstable. Israel is on a was on a path to normalization with the Arab world. I'm guessing that will have to wait. Same with the two-state solution. The trust deficit between Israelis and Palestinians has widened. In 2012, 61% Israelis backed a two-state solution. But after October 7th, that number is less than 25%. So the sentiment has clearly shifted, not just on the Israeli side, but across the region. For hawks like Netanyahu, this is good. He's never liked the two-state solution. Plus, he's always wanted a direct face-off with Iran. But in the long run, it could quash the hopes of a stable West Asia. Israel's wars are in full swing. Netanyahu already has his hands full, but he has decided to pick another fight, this time with an unlikely opponent, French President Emmanuel Macron. The latest tiff started because of Macron's comments on Saturday.
Nous essayons aussi d'être cohérents.
Et
lorsque nous demandons des cessez-le-feu, c'est le cas pour Gaza, ça a aussi été le cas pour le Liban la semaine dernière, eh bien, nous tâchons de ne pas demander un cessez-le-feu tout en continuant à livrer les armes de la guerre. Et je pense que c'est simplement de la cohérence. La semaine dernière, à New York,
Last week, in New York, President Biden, like myself, endorsed a ceasefire text for Lebanon that the United States was in favor of. In finalizing this text, it had been discussed with both Lebanese actors and Israel. And I regret that Prime Minister Netanyahu made another choice and took on this responsibility, in particular land operations on Lebanese soil. And so, yes, if we call for a ceasefire, what's consistent is not to provide weapons of war. And I think that those who supply them cannot call for a ceasefire every day and continue to supply them.
It seems logical enough. It's hypocritical and frankly absurd to call for a ceasefire while fueling a war, while supplying weapons being used in the same war. And France really does not provide weapons to Israel. They sent just about $33 million worth of equipment last year, which is what Israel burns through in a day. So Emmanuel Macron is not lying. And he's right about the hypocrisy. It's something that the US would do well to understand. But Macron's statement drew sharp criticism from Netanyahu.
As Israel fights the forces of barbarism led by Iran, all civilized countries should be standing firmly by Israel's side. Yet President Macron and some other Western leaders are now calling for an arms embargo against Israel. Shame on them. Is Iran imposing an arms embargo on Hezbollah, on the Houthis, on Hamas, and on its other proxies? Of course not. The axis of terror stands together. But countries who supposedly oppose this terror axis call for an arms embargo on Israel. What a disgrace.
Now, some of you might agree with Netanyahu. Iran definitely won't impose an arms embargo on its proxies. So then why is Macron calling for an end to arms supplies to Israel? Well, Macron has his own agenda. Right now, he's concerned about just one thing, and that is the safety of Lebanon. For those of you who don't know, here are some facts about Lebanon. It's a country in West Asia. It is located to the north of Israel. The population there is about 68% Muslim, both Shia and Sunni, 68%, and about 32% Christian, mostly Maronite Christians who are in full communion with the Catholic Church. What's more, this country is francophone, meaning they speak French. Arabic is the official language of Lebanon, but about half the country can speak some degree of French. French is sometimes used as an official language in governance. This is because France once controlled Lebanon. It was in the aftermath of the First World War. France was given Lebanon and Syria after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, Lebanon exists as we know it today because of France. Here is what Paris did. It merged the Maronite Christian territories with the traditionally Arab areas, and it created the modern country of Lebanon. So France has ties with Lebanon and its people. Now, with this in mind, let's look at the situation in Lebanon again. Israel is fighting Hezbollah, a Shiite militant group based in Lebanon, living side by side with Sunni Muslims and Maronite Christians. Israel is bombing Lebanon, and the bombs do not differentiate between the Hezbollah fighter and the Lebanese civilian. So a large proportion of the people getting killed are French-speaking Maronite Christians. This would be enough to bother any French president, and Emmanuel Macron has always seen himself as something more, a new unifier of the French-speaking world. His achievements on that front can be doubted, but his ambition cannot. Macron has always wanted to be seen as a leader of Europe and of French-speaking countries. And that is why he spoke out this weekend while his country was hosting a summit of Francophone nations. It was another attempt to take the leading role in the French-speaking world, and it's something that Lebanon is counting on.
Frankly, we're counting on France a lot, much more than other countries. We are also counting heavily on the Franco-American initiative, which was prepared in New York.
So will Macron's support change anything, or will it just make Netanyahu more aggressive? Guess we'll find out in the days to come.
बेबस मर्दों, औरतों और बच्चों की खातिर न लड़ो।
हमेशा ह्यूमन राइट्स के लिए बात आवाज बुलंद की है। मोहतरम जनाब मोहम्मद हुसैन मेहंदी साहब अमीर जमात इस्लामी सूबा से मोहतरम जनाब
से 6 गुना से ज्यादा है, जिसके नतीजे में तकरीबन 50
हमास के मुजाहिदों ने आज से 1 साल कबल
लुबनान को भी शामिल करने की कोशिश की है। आज
very much everyone for coming here. We already have 6 people that are holding
Shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, Avinu shebashamayim.
Fighting a war is not easy, but do you know what makes it even tougher? When one of your best men is nowhere to be found. It seems that's the case with Iran. One of their top generals, Ismail Ghani, has reportedly gone missing. Ghani is the chief of the Quds Force. That's an elite branch of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards. It deals with Iran's proxy groups across West Asia, including the Hezbollah in Lebanon. And that is where Ghani was since last month, in Lebanon. When Israel struck the Lebanese capital Beirut last week, he went out of contact. Reports said that he'd gone missing, and it fueled a lot of speculation. Finally, Tehran has made an official announcement on the matter. Our next report tells you more.
Over the weekend, while Iran awaited a potential counterstrike from Israel, the country's senior officials had one question. Where is Ismail Ghani? Ghani is one of Iran's top generals. He is a veteran of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and became the commander-in-chief of the Quds Force about 4 years ago. Quds is an elite branch of the Revolutionary Guards. It is tasked with operations which deal with Iran's proxy groups across West Asia, like the Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, as well as groups in Iraq and Syria, which Iran called its axis of resistance. It has received one blow after another as the war with Israel intensifies and spreads. Israel has hit multiple targets in Lebanon. It has killed much of Hezbollah's military command. Last month, an Israeli airstrike on Beirut killed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, along with Iranian Revolutionary Guards commander Abbas Nilfurushan. So the Quds commander Ghani travelled to Lebanon. And last Thursday, Israel struck Beirut again. This time reportedly targeting Hashim Safedini, who is seen as the potential new leader of Hezbollah. Now, Safedin has been missing since the attack. But apparently, so is Ghani, who is in the same vicinity of Beirut's southern suburbs of Daheh. Over the weekend, reports claimed that Ghani has not been heard from since last Thursday's strikes. Iranian officials have reportedly claimed that Khani is out of contact. Meanwhile, Turkish and Israeli media claim Khani could be dead, that he could have been killed by the Israeli strike. While there is no proof, the sentiment in Iran has been one of growing anxiety. Khani was last seen in public in Iran at the Tehran offices of Hezbollah last month. More importantly, he was absent last Friday when Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei led a rare prayer service. As speculations mounted, Iran was forced to respond. Today, the deputy commander of Quds, Iraj Masjidi, said, "He is in good health and is carrying out his activities. Some ask us to issue a statement. There is no need for this." But is Tehran's two-sentence explanation enough to quell fears? After all, according to reports, search and rescue operations are not complete at last week's attack site in Beirut. Hezbollah accuses Israel of hindering the operation. So the potential successor of Hezbollah is still out of contact, and Quds claims their chief is alive and well, but without any proof, while reports claim that both may be dead. If these rumors turn out to be true, this would be another big blow to Hezbollah and its patron Iran. Not only will it leave the issue of succession in question, but further cut off Iran's remaining limbs across West Asia.
The war in West Asia is bad news for the global economy. It's a no-brainer, really. Conflicts anywhere create new challenges. And this is an oil-producing region, West Asia. So conflict here creates multiple uncertainties, especially for oil-importing countries like India. So how is India faring? Is the war hurting our growth story, or is India showing resilience? Leading economists have been weighing in on this subject, and they remain optimistic about India. One of them is Larry Summers, former US Treasury Secretary and now a professor at Harvard. Last week, Larry Summers was asked about the Indian economy and he was bullish. Listen to what he said, I'm quoting, "I'm optimistic about India's prospects to increase its GDP sixfold by the century of independence and be the most rapidly growing economy in the world over the next 5 years, the next decade and the next generation among major economies." So by 2047, India would increase its GDP by 6 times. That is what Summers says. He also hailed Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his economic policies. According to Summers, Prime Minister Modi has, quote-unquote, energized the Indian economy. He praised India's progress in building both physical and digital infrastructure. And Summers is not the only one saying this. Alvaro Santos Pereira is also bullish on India. He is the chief economist of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an intergovernmental organization, sort of like a club of rich countries. It has 38 members, OECD, and it works to promote global trade. India is not a member of OECD, but it works closely with this group. And this is the OECD's assessment of India, that recent reforms will benefit the Indian economy. Again, I have a quote. It's exactly this reformist attitude that you can see prevailing and across all levels of government. Every time that I come here, I see progress. The country is moving very well. India will continue to do really well in the next few decades. Which reforms is Pereira referring to? Broadly two. First, how we deal with bankrupt companies, and second, how we get foreign investments. These are the two things that he's talking about. Let's take this one by one. The first reform is the insolvency and bankruptcy system. What is an insolvent company? It is one that cannot repay its debt. Basically, a company that has run out of cash. Earlier, India lacked a mechanism to deal with such companies. So it took years for a failed business to wind up. It was very hard to shut a business in India, but that's not the case anymore. The government introduced a reform. It sped up the liquidation of failed businesses, meaning you can now quickly wrap up and move on. According to the OECD, that's the first big positive. The second is the easing of restrictions in FDI. FDI, as you would know, is foreign direct investment. It's easier to get it now, so there are fewer hoops to jump through. Pereira says these changes have made India attractive to investors, both foreign and domestic investors. So India's long-term growth story remains intact. What about the short term? Will geopolitical challenges slow down India's growth? Honestly, it's too soon to tell, but Indian businesses are not too worried. The CII recently conducted a survey, that's the Confederation of Indian Industry. This survey revealed some interesting insights. Businesses are confident about India's growth. And where does this optimism stem from? For starters, consumption activity. Businesses feel that it is going to rise in the coming days, including the demand from rural India. They expect it to rise, it's expected to strengthen. What else? Fresh private investment and the government's continued focus on reforms. All these factors together are being seen as positives for the Indian economy. So the momentum is clearly in India's favor. The challenge now is to turn it into long-term sustainable growth. The India out president is in India. I'm talking about Mohammad Muizzu, the president of the Maldives. He was elected last year on the promise of India out, and he did follow through. Muizzu removed Indian soldiers from his country. He also cozied up to China and Turkey. But now, reality has hit. Muizzu is on a 5-day state visit to India. Today he was in New Delhi. First he received a ceremonial welcome in the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Then he held talks with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And finally he signed some deals. Of course, everyone is asking the same question. Is this a U-turn? And if it is, then why? Well, the first answer is yes. It is a U-turn, a classic one. Muizzu had called India a bully. He said his country was not anyone's backyard. Compared to that, his tone has certainly softened. Listen to this.
India is a key partner in the socio-economic and infrastructure development of the Maldives and has stood by the Maldives during our times of need.
Bully to keep partner. He's come a long way. Prime Minister Modi also praised this relationship. He highlighted India's neighbourhood first policy. He also talked about India's role as the first responder.
भारत और मालदीव के संबंध सदियों पुराने हैं और भारत मालदीव का सबसे करीबी पड़ोसी और घनिष्ठ मित्र देश है। भारत ने सदैव मालदीव के लिए फर्स्ट रिस्पॉन्डर की भूमिका निभाई है। आपकी यात्रा से हमारे संबंधों में एक नया अध्याय जुड़ रहा है।
So great optics, very warm statements. Finally, we come to the deals. India and the Maldives have elevated their ties. It is now a comprehensive economic and strategic partnership. India has also extended some financial help. 2 currency swap deals. One is worth $400 million. The second is 30 billion rupees, which is about $360 million. These will boost the Maldives' forex reserves. A few initiatives were also announced, like the launch of the RuPay card in the Maldives and the handover of some 700 houses, all built using Indian lines of credit. And Muizzu's trip is not over yet. He will also be travelling to Agra, Mumbai and Bengaluru, and he will only return home on Thursday. So quite a long stay for Muizzu, and that too in a country that he villainized not very long ago. What explains this change of heart? Mainly the economic condition of his country. The Maldives' forex reserves are at $440 million, which can cover imports for up to 6 weeks. What happens after that? Mali could run out of dollars. What's more, a debt payment is coming up this month. The Maldives has issued Islamic bonds worth $500 million, and this month a $25 million payment is due. Now, no country has ever defaulted on Islamic bonds. The worry is that Mali could be the first. So what does Muizzu do? Fly over to India. He says India will ease his financial burden, and he's right. In May this year, India did renew its subscription to Maldivian treasury bonds. That was $100 million. And today, 2 more packages were announced. So Muizzu did get the help that he wanted, that he was hoping for. Basically, a bailout from India, that's what he's got. Secondly, he is wooing Indian tourists. Many of them have ditched the Maldives, especially after this year's diplomatic standoff. Indian footfall in the Maldives has dropped by 50,000. It has led to losses worth $150 million. That's a lot of money for this country, the Maldives, which is why their president, Mohammad Muizzu, is traveling beyond Delhi. He wants to spread the message that Indians are welcome in his country. It is basically a reality check for Muizzu. He thought that he could cut India out, maybe replace New Delhi with Beijing, but that is easier said than done. The Maldives has depended on India for most things: food, infrastructure, health, sometimes even drinking water. And a big reason for that is geography. India is just 300 kilometers from the Maldives' northern islands. China is thousands of kilometers away. So you cannot expect China to replace India. It is, of course, geographically impossible, but also politically impossible. Perhaps Muizzu has realized that, which is why he circled back to India. For New Delhi, this is a victory for quiet diplomacy. Remember, India never responded to Muizzu's public outcries. It simply waited for reality to kick in, and it has paid off. Now, the key is to build on this new foundation to make sure that such episodes do not repeat again. In Pakistan, there was a suicide blast today. It killed 2 Chinese nationals and the third one is in critical condition. The attack targeted a Chinese convoy. It was leaving Karachi's international airport. That's when the blast happened. The Baloch Liberation Army has claimed responsibility for this, saying that it was behind this attack. Islamabad says it won't go unpunished. It promises strict action. It looks like China wants more than words. It wants concrete protection for its people and its projects in Pakistan. The question is, can Islamabad or Rawalpindi assure that? Because this is not the first such attack on Chinese interests in Pakistan. Here's our report.
It was around 11 p.m. local time. Chinese workers were traveling in a convoy when a massive blast hit them. 2 people were killed. 1 remains injured. 9 locals were also hurt in the blast. It took place near Karachi's international airport. Security officials rushed to the scene. So did multiple firefighters. Several charred vehicles were found at the site.
जो इनिशियल इतला हुई है वो एक ऑयल टैंकर जो है उसके आग लगने से जो मुतअद्दिद गाड़ियां जो है वो उसकी जद में आई हैं और उससे बहुत सारा कोलैटरल डैमेज हुआ है. उसको हम अभी मजीद असर्टेन कर रहे हैं कि इसमें दहशतगर्दी का एलिमेंट या कोई और एलिमेंट जो है तखरीबकारी का वो किस हद तक है जिसको हम अभी रूल आउट नहीं कर सकते.
Soon, the element of terrorism emerged. The attack was claimed by the Baloch Liberation Army, a separatist group banned in Pakistan. The perpetrator was a man called Shah Fahad. He was part of the Majid Brigade. That's the Baloch Liberation Army's dedicated suicide squad. They used an improvised explosive device, or IED. The target was a high-level convoy. It consisted of Chinese engineers and investors. They were just leaving the Jinnah International Airport. Pakistan's Prime Minister has called it a heinous act. He offered condolences to China. Meanwhile, Beijing wants more than just condolences. It wants punishment for the attackers. China is calling this a terror attack, and it wants Islamabad to act fast to punish the perpetrators. But this isn't the first for either China or Pakistan. The Chinese officials who were killed worked for the Port Qasim Electric Power Company. It's located around 37 kilometers southeast of Karachi. The project is part of the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It's a part of China's multi-billion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative. So, thousands of Chinese workers are in Pakistan. They are working on these projects, and Islamabad can't seem to guarantee their safety. In 2018, the Chinese consulate in Karachi was targeted. In 2020, the Pakistan Stock Exchange was attacked because it's partly owned by a Chinese consortium. In 2022, another suicide attack near a Confucius Institute killed 3 Chinese tutors. In March this year, 5 Chinese engineers were killed. This was near the China-backed Dasu hydropower project. But the question is, Why is the Baloch Liberation Army targeting Chinese projects? The separatist group believes Beijing is helping Islamabad exploit Balochistan. It accuses both China and Pakistan of unfair exploitation of resources by outsiders in the mineral-rich region, hence the attacks. Beijing has long asked Pakistan to control the attacks, but Islamabad has repeatedly failed to do so. In fact, last year, it even shut down Chinese businesses in the name of keeping them safe. The attack also comes just days ahead of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or SCO meeting, so this could be a problem for Pakistan. It must keep its big brother China happy while guaranteeing security for the SCO nations. Will Islamabad be able to guarantee that? Well, their track record doesn't inspire any confidence.
Now let's turn to Africa, to Tunisia in the north. Tunisia is a country of about 12 million people, and yesterday it held an election. The official result is not out yet, but everyone knows what is going to happen. The incumbent president, Kais Saied, will win a second term. The win is a bit of an exaggeration. Saied orchestrated a farcical election and will now continue his reign. This may sound harsh, but here are the facts. Kais Saied became president in 2019 after a real election, which went to the second round, and over half the population had turned up to vote. So far, so good. But then in 2021, Saied dismissed Tunisia's parliament, promulgated a new constitution, giving himself almost absolute power. He appointed his own Supreme Court judges, his own election commission, and he barred other courts from interfering in elections. Does that sound democratic to you? When the election was announced, 16 people wanted to compete against him. 16 people. All but 2 were disqualified. And then one of the 2 other presidential candidates was jailed. And last week, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He joined other opposition leaders, critics, and journalists behind bars. All this happened before yesterday's election, so you can understand why Tunisians were not very keen to vote. Exit polls say the turnout was less than 28%, which makes sense. Why line up to participate in a farce? Sadly, this story sounds all too familiar. Before 2011, Tunisia was the abode of dictators. Just 2 men ruled the nation for 54 years. The first was Habib Bourguiba, who ruled for 30 years, until he was overthrown by his own Prime Minister, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Ben Ali became the second Tunisian dictator. He ruled the country for 24 years. But towards the end, something unexpected happened. On the 17th of December 2010, a fruit vendor set himself on fire. He was tired of being harassed by Ben Ali's police forces. He was tired of the repression and humiliation ordinary people went through, so he set himself on fire, this fruit vendor, and his act triggered mass protests. It was dubbed the Jasmine Revolution. The vendor did not survive to see its end. He died on 4th January 2011. And 10 days later, Ben Ali was overthrown. He fled Tunisia and later died in exile. Tunisia's revolution was a success, and it did not stop there. Tunisia inspired revolutions all over the Arab world. It started the so-called Arab Spring. Protests erupted from Morocco all the way to Oman. Egypt's president of 30 years, Hosni Mubarak, was forced to step down. A civil war began in Libya, leading to the assassination of their leader, Muammar Gaddafi. The president of Yemen resigned. The prime minister of Kuwait stepped down. There were upheavals all over the Arab world. But in hindsight, nothing seems to have changed. When the Arab Spring reached Syria, President Bashar al-Assad fought back. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Syria was devastated. 13 years later, Assad is still president. 13 years after Hosni Mubarak's ouster, you have a military general in charge of Egypt. 13 years after Gaddafi's death, there are 2 competing governments in Libya, and 13 years after Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution, you have Kais Saied, a man jailing his opponents, taking billions in loans from Europe and conducting sham polls. As they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Speaking of which, corporate bigwigs are also changing things up. They're green targets. That's what they're changing. The latest is BP, the British oil giant. In 2020, BP announced a very ambitious target. to cut their oil output by 40% by 2030. The goal was to move towards renewables. Last year, that target was scaled back from 40% to 25%. People did raise some eyebrows, but they thought, well, something is better than nothing. Well, now it is nothing. Latest reports say that BP has abandoned the target altogether. They will not reduce oil output by 2030 at all. In fact, they're doubling down. BP is eyeing 3 oil projects in Iraq, 1 in Kuwait, and 2 in the Gulf of Mexico. But why the change in direction? Well, mainly 2 reasons. One is investor concerns. BP shares are 17% down in the last 6 months. So the company wants to turn things around. How? By focusing on its bread and butter, or in this case, oil and gas. Reason number 2 is geopolitics. You see, Europe is turning away from Russian oil and gas, so there is an energy crunch in the region. Renewables alone cannot solve it. And it's not just BP. Shell is doing something similar. They planned a 45% cut in carbon emissions by 2035. That target has been removed. And why just firms? Why just companies? Why just oil firms, in fact? Other companies are also doing it. Consider the auto industry. Toyota was planning to sell 1.5 million electric vehicles by 2026. 1.5 by 2026. Their new target is 1 million. Volvo was planning to go 100% electric by 2030, again cancelled. Ford had set aside 40% of its annual spending on EVs, electric vehicles. It's been cut to 30%. Mercedes-Benz said half of their sales would be EVs by 2025. They have revised it to 2030. Even governments are guilty of the same. Look at what Britain did last year. They were supposed to ban petrol and diesel cars by 2030. But they delayed it by 5 years. They also pushed back the ban on gas boilers. Now, do you see the problem here? Climate targets are already seen as half-hearted. So the last thing you need is revisions. It erodes public trust in climate action. You see, these targets are mostly self-imposed. Even the UN goals are not binding. You saw the United States leave the Paris Climate Accords under Donald Trump. Any country is free to do that. They can revise, reduce, or cancel their commitments. The question is, why do they do it? And politics, we can tell you, is a major factor here. You need stability to invest in green energy. You cannot do it in the middle of a conflict. Just consider the Ukraine war. The targets were set during peacetime when Russian gas flowed freely into Europe. When that stopped, energy prices increased, and along with it, inflation went up. So European leaders faced a simple choice: continue the green pivot and risk more inflation, or use fossil fuels to cool the prices. And most leaders picked option number 2, which is not surprising at all. Secondly, the clean energy supply chains are vulnerable. You need specific resources to build batteries and panels like cobalt and lithium. Around 70% of the cobalt comes from the Congo. 40% of the nickel supply comes from Indonesia, 55% of mined lithium from Australia, and 25% from Chile. Most of the processing happens in China. They make up 60% of all mass-produced clean technologies like solar cells or windmill systems or batteries. And this sort of a supply chain is not reliable, especially if you're de-risking or decoupling from China. So the problem is quite obvious. World leaders and corporate bigwigs made grand commitments, and they earned a lot of praise for it. But their roadmap was not charted out well, nor did they account for political hiccups. In hindsight, they look like half-baked promises. The fact is, we need some way to enforce commitments, if not on companies, at least on countries to start with. Else, climate targets will mean nothing.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
बेबस मर्दों, औरतों और बच्चों की खातिर न लड़ो।
हमेशा ह्यूमन राइट्स के लिए बात आवाज बुलंद की है।
मोहतरम जनाब मोहम्मद हुसैन मेहदी साहब अमीर जमात इस्लामी सूबा से, मोहतरम जनाब
से 6 गुना से ज्यादा है, जिसके नतीजे में तकरीबन 50
हमास के मुजाहिदों ने आज से 1 साल कबल
लुबनान को भी शामिल करने की कोशिश की है। आज
very much everyone for coming here. We already have 6 people